The final stitch pulled taut, securing a loose button on her son's small coat. Annalise snipped the thread, her movements economical and precise, honed by a decade of making do. The cottage, nestled against the Cornish cliffs, was filled with the scent of salt and drying herbs. It was a small life, a quiet one, but it was theirs. For 10 years, she had been Mrs. Allen, a widow with a bright, inquisitive boy who had his mother's gentle nature and a startlingly aristocratic jawline he could not have inherited from her. A fiction had been her fortress, simple and sturdy. She had left Blackwood Manor on her wedding night, a girl of 18, reeling from a humiliation so profound it had scoured her soul clean of hope. The Duke, Alistair Beaumont, a man she had met only twice before the ceremony, had looked at her not with malice, but with a chilling, absolute indifference. His words had been quiet, delivered with the finality of a judge passing sentence. You will have a generous allowance. You will live wherever you wish, so long as it is not here. Do not write. Do not return. You are the Duchess of Blackwood in name only. That is all. He had turned away, leaving her standing in the cavernous bridal suite, her white gown feeling like a shroud. She had obeyed. She had walked out into the pre-dawn mist, with nothing but a small valise, and a secret she herself did not yet know she carried. Now, at 28, the fortress was crumbling. A letter lay on the mantelpiece, its crisp parchment a stark intruder among the worn books and smooth sea stones. The cottage was to be sold. Their landlord, an amiable old captain, had passed away, and his heirs in London had no sentiment for a tenant widow. They had 2 months to vacate. The pittance of an allowance, sent quarterly by a solicitor who knew her only as Mrs. Allen, was enough for rent and bread, but not enough to secure a new home, not in a world that was growing more expensive by the day. Her son, Thomas, sat at the table, carefully carving a piece of driftwood into the shape of a seabird. He was 9 years old, a whisper away from 10, and the image of a man he had never met. He had the same thick, dark hair that waved at the temple, the same intense concentration in his eyes, though his were a warm hazel to his father's cool, guarded blue. Looking at him was like looking at a ghost, a memory made of flesh and blood. It was a constant, aching reminder of the life she had been denied. For 10 years, her pride had been the wall she built around her heart. She had been dismissed, discarded like an inconvenient piece of luggage. To return would be to admit defeat, to crawl back to the man who had made it clear she was nothing to him. But now, it was not just her pride at stake. It was Thomas's future. He deserved more than a life of quiet desperation, of moving from one rented room to another. He was the son of a duke. He was the heir to Blackwood. He just didn't know it. Her fingers tightened on the small coat. The decision settled over her, not with a rush of courage, but with the heavy, cold certainty of a winter tide. She had been sent away, but she had not been divorced. She had not been disowned by law, only by one man's decree. The name she had not used in a decade felt foreign on her tongue. Annalise Beaumont, Duchess of Blackwood. It was a key. She did not know what lock it would open, or if the door beyond led to salvation or a deeper ruin, but it was the only key she possessed. She would go back, not as the trembling bride who had fled in shame, but as a mother with a son whose existence was a truth Alistair could not ignore. The journey north was a pilgrimage into a past she had tried to bury. The silence in the carriage was as heavy as wet wool, broken only by Thomas's occasional questions about the changing landscape. He was excited, seeing it as a grand adventure. Annalise felt a knot of dread tightening in her stomach with every mile that brought them closer to the imposing estate. She had told Thomas they were going to visit a distant relative who might be able to help them. The lie felt thin and brittle, and she feared it would shatter the moment they arrived. When the carriage turned onto the long, winding drive of Blackwood Manor, her breath caught. The trees, ancient and sprawling, formed a canopy that cast the road in shadow even in the midday sun. And then the house came into view. It was not a home, it was a monument of grey stone and stern, unblinking windows, a fortress built to keep the world out. At the gates, the Blackwood crest was wrought in iron, a single, stylized raven clutching a key in its beak, the symbol of his house, secrets and ownership. She paid the driver and stepped out, her hand firmly holding Thomas's. He looked up at the vast facade, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and intimidation. Annalise took a steadying breath and walked to the massive oak doors. The brass knocker was cold and heavy in her hand. The sound echoed in the sudden quiet, a sharp, metallic summons that seemed to challenge the house's profound silence. Minutes stretched into an eternity. She was about to knock again when the door creaked open. An elderly butler, a man she vaguely recognized as Mr. Finch, stood there, his expression one of polite inquiry that froze into utter disbelief. His eyes flickered from her face to the boy at her side, and a lifetime of disciplined composure vanished. He simply stared, his mouth slightly agape. "I am the Duchess of Blackwood," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I have come home." Finch seemed to age another decade in that moment. He recovered himself with a visible effort, bowing stiffly. "Your Grace," he murmured, his voice a dry rasp. We were not expecting you." "I am aware," she said, stepping over the threshold into the great hall. It was exactly as she remembered, a cavern of shadows and polished marble, cold and silent as a tomb. Suits of armor stood like sentinels along the walls, and a grand staircase swept upwards into the gloom. The air was still and smelled faintly of beeswax and old stone. Nothing had changed. It was a house preserved in amber, a place where time had stopped. "His Grace is in the library," Finch managed, his gaze still fixed on Thomas, who clung a little tighter to Annalise's hand. "Shall I announce you?" "No," she said. "I will announce myself." She led Thomas toward the library doors, her heart hammering against her ribs with a force that made her feel lightheaded. This was it, the confrontation 10 years in the making. She pushed open the heavy mahogany doors and stepped inside. Alistair was standing by the fireplace, one hand resting on the marble mantel. He had not heard them enter. At 35, the decade had sharpened the angles of his face, carving away any hint of youthful softness. There were threads of silver at his temples, and a profound stillness about him, the rigid self-control of a man who lived his life on a leash. He turned, his blue eyes coolly indifferent, expecting the butler. When he saw her, his entire body went rigid, every muscle locked. It was not shock or anger that crossed his face, but a stark, bone-deep weariness, as if a ghost he had long since laid to rest had just walked through the wall. "Annalise," he said. Her name was a ghost of a sound in the silent room. "Alistair," she replied, her voice a low, steady anchor in the swirling chaos of her emotions. His gaze dropped from her face to the small boy standing beside her. He froze. The blood drained from his face, leaving his skin the color of ash. He stared at Thomas, at the dark, waving hair, the set of his jaw, the shape of his eyes. He was looking at a miniature of himself, a reflection in a pool he never knew existed. The silence in the room became a physical pressure, a suffocating weight. Annalise felt a tremor run through Thomas's hand and tightened her grip. She would not let him be afraid. She had come here for him. She lifted her chin, meeting the Duke's stunned, uncomprehending gaze. "You told me to leave and never return," she said, her voice clear, and cutting through the suffocating silence. I obeyed. What you did not know was that I was not leaving alone. She took a small step forward, moving Thomas slightly in front of her, a shield and a statement. Alistair, I would like to introduce you to your son. His name is Thomas. The days that followed were a strange, brittle truce. Alistair had installed them in a suite of rooms in the East Wing, a part of the house that felt less like a museum and more like a place where people might actually live. The rooms were warm and bright, with views of the sprawling, manicured gardens. It was a gilded cage, comfortable and yet utterly confining. They existed in a state of suspended animation. He did not ask her to leave, but he did not ask her to stay. They were ghosts haunting the same house, moving through the long corridors and silent rooms with a careful, deliberate distance between them. Dinners were the worst. They would sit at opposite ends of a dining table that could have seated 20, the silence broken only by the clink of silverware on porcelain. Thomas, bless his innocent heart, was the only one immune to the crushing tension. He was fascinated by the sheer scale of the manor, by the suits of armor and the vast library. He asked endless questions, his bright curiosity a small, flickering candle in the gloom. Annalise watched Alistair during these moments. He would listen to Thomas's chatter, his expression unreadable, his gaze fixed on the boy with an intensity that was both unnerving and deeply sad. He never spoke directly to Thomas, but he watched him. He watched him the way a starving man might watch a banquet through a window. Annalise found herself studying her husband, this stranger who held their fate in his hands. The cold, indifferent man she remembered from her wedding night was still there, but she saw other things now. She saw the deep lines of exhaustion etched around his eyes. She saw the way his hands would clench at his sides when he thought no one was looking. He was not indifferent. He was contained. He was a man holding himself together with sheer force of will. One afternoon, she found him in the gallery, standing before a portrait of his father, the previous duke. The man in the painting was handsome, but there was a wild, cruel light in his eyes that the artist had not been able to soften. Alistair stood perfectly still, his back to her, and for the first time, Annalise felt a flicker of something other than fear or resentment. She felt a sliver of pity. "He looks like you," she said softly. Alistair started, not having heard her approach. He turned, his face a mask of cold composure, but she had seen the flicker of raw pain in his eyes before it was shuttered away. "A shallow resemblance," he said, his voice clipped. "Is that what you believe?" She pressed, emboldened by a sudden need to understand. 10 years, Alistair, 10 years of silence. I deserve to know why. He looked at her, his blue eyes like chips of ice. "I gave you your freedom. I gave you a fortune." Most women would have considered that a more than fair exchange for a loveless marriage. "It wasn't a fair exchange. It was a dismissal," she retorted, her own anger surprising her. "I was a problem you paid to have removed. But you have a new problem now. One you cannot pay to send away. He has your name. He has your face. He is your son." His composure cracked like a pane of frosted glass, a fine web of fissures spreading from the point of impact. "Do not think I am unaware of that," he bit out, his voice low and strained. He took a step toward her, and for the first time she saw not coldness, but a raging, helpless storm within him. "Every moment he is in this house, I am aware." He stopped, breathing heavily, as if the admission had cost him dearly. He turned and strode from the room, leaving her alone with the portrait of his father. She realized then that this was not about her at all. It was about him. And it was about the man in the painting. A few days later, the first crack in his armor appeared in an unexpected way. Annalise had been reading in the morning room when she heard a commotion from the hall. She found Thomas standing at the bottom of the grand staircase, his face pale, holding his arm. Mrs. Gable, the kindly housekeeper, was fussing over him. He had slipped on the polished marble steps. Before anyone could react, Alistair was there. He moved with a speed and urgency that was utterly at odds with his usual measured stillness. He knelt before Thomas, his face a mask of raw, unfiltered panic. "Are you hurt?" "Show me," he commanded, his voice tight with an emotion she couldn't name. It sounded like fear. He gently examined Thomas's arm, his touch surprisingly tender. Thomas, startled by the sudden attention from this silent, looming man, just shook his head, tears welling in his eyes, more from shock than pain. Alistair's expression softened as he saw the boy was not seriously injured. He looked up, and his eyes met Annalise's over their son's head. In that moment, the mask was gone. She saw a man terrified, vulnerable, and utterly lost. He looked away quickly, composing himself, and stood. "See that he rests," he said stiffly to Mrs. Gable, and then he turned and walked away without another word. The incident lingered in Annalise's mind. His reaction had been too extreme for a simple fall. It was the reaction of a man who lived in constant fear of disaster, of some terrible, unnamed thing lurking just out of sight. Her curiosity deepened, mingling with a strange, unwelcome sense of empathy. Who was this man, truly? The answer began to arrive in the form of a visitor. A man introduced himself as Mr. Peregrine Croft, Alistair's cousin and, until Thomas's arrival, his presumed heir. Croft was handsome, charming, and possessed a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He showered Annalise with solicitous attention and praised Thomas's spirit, but Annalise felt a chill whenever he was near. His questions were casual, but they were sharp, probing for details about her 10 years away, about Thomas's birth, about her reasons for returning. "It is a miracle, is it not?" Croft said to her one afternoon in the garden, while Thomas chased a butterfly nearby. "Alistair, shut away in this mausoleum for a decade, and suddenly a wife and heir appear. It changes everything." He smiled, but the look in his eyes was speculative and cold. One must be so careful to ensure everything is in order. Legacies are fragile things. The veiled threat was unmistakable. He was questioning Thomas's legitimacy. He was planting seeds of doubt. Annalise felt a surge of protective fury. She had not come this far to have her son's birthright threatened by a grasping relative. That evening, she sought out Alistair in the library. He was staring into the fire, a glass of brandy untouched on the table beside him. "Your cousin is a viper," she said without preamble. Alistair did not turn. "I am aware of what Peregrine is. He is making inquiries. He is suggesting that Thomas is an invention." The word tasted like poison. "Let him," Alistair said, his voice flat. "The truth is the truth." "Is it?" she challenged, stepping closer. "Or is the truth whatever the powerful decide it is? He sees you locked away in this house, a recluse. He sees a woman who was gone for 10 years. He will paint a picture that suits him, and people will believe it. You must do something. There is nothing to be done," he said, his voice heavy with resignation. "There is everything to be done." She insisted, her voice rising. "You are his father. You are the Duke. Fight for him." He finally turned to face her, and the anguish in his eyes struck her silent. "You think this is a fight I have not been waging every day of my life?" he asked, his voice raw. "You do not understand what you are asking of me." "Then make me understand," she whispered, her anger draining away, replaced by a desperate need to know the secret that was eating him alive. "Alistair, please, tell me why. Why did you send me away? Why are you letting that man threaten your son? Why do you live like this? A prisoner in your own home." He stared at her for a long moment, a silent, terrible war raging within him. The firelight cast flickering shadows across his face, making him seem both older and younger at once. He finally broke, the words spilling out of him in a torrent of long-suppressed pain. "My father," he began, his voice barely a whisper. The man in the portrait, he was not just cruel. He was mad. It was a sickness of the mind, a darkness that grew in him until it consumed everything. He was charming to the world, but within these walls, he faltered, his gaze distant and haunted. He was a monster. He saw conspiracies in every shadow, betrayal in every kindness. His temper was a physical force. He destroyed my mother with his paranoia, wore her down until she simply faded away. Toward the end, he did not even recognize me. He saw an enemy. Annalise listened, her heart aching for the boy he must have been, living in the shadow of such a man. "The doctors called it a malady of the blood," Alistair continued, his voice hoarse. "Hereditary, they said it often skips a generation. But sometimes it does not." I watched him descend into that hell, and I saw myself in his eyes. I felt the same black moods, the same instinct to withdraw, to trust no one. I was terrified that the same poison was in my veins. He looked at her, and she finally understood. The coldness, the distance, the self-imposed prison, it was all fear. "When we were married," he said, his voice breaking, "I looked at you, so young and full of life, and all I could see was my mother. I saw what he would do to you, what I might do to you. I couldn't bear it. Sending you away was the cruelest thing I have ever done, but I did it because I believed it was the only way to protect you. From this house, from this title, from me." The confession hung in the air between them, devastating and absolute. He had not cast her out in anger or indifference. He had done it out of a twisted, terrified, self-hating love. He had exiled himself to save her. "And Thomas?" She breathed, the final piece clicking into place. "Your reaction when he fell?" "He is my son," Alistair said, a look of profound agony on his face. "He has my blood. How can I look at him and not live in mortal terror of the day the darkness might show itself in him? Or that my own darkness might touch him? I have stayed away from him in this house because I am trying to protect him, too." Annalise felt tears welling in her eyes. 10 years of bitterness and resentment dissolved in an instant, washed away by a wave of crushing empathy. He was not a monster. He was a man who had been so profoundly wounded that he had cut himself off from any hope of being healed. She reached out and, for the first time, touched him. She laid her hand on his arm. He flinched, but did not pull away. "You are not your father, Alistair," she said softly but with unshakable conviction. "In 10 years you have shown cruelty to only one person, yourself. A monster would not sacrifice his own happiness to protect others. A monster would not be terrified of hurting his own child. What you see as a curse, your self-control, your discipline, that is your strength. That is how I know you are not him." He looked down at her hand on his arm, and then up at her face, his expression one of dawning, fragile hope. The secret was out. The weight he had carried alone for so long was now shared. In his vulnerability, she saw not weakness, but the man he could be, the man he had always been, buried beneath layers of fear. And in that moment, she knew what she had to do. This was no longer just about Thomas's future. It was about theirs. The summons came 2 days later. A formal letter from Peregrine Croft's solicitor requesting a meeting. Present would be Alistair, Croft, and the 2 senior trustees of the Blackwood estate. The purpose, the letter stated coolly, was to discuss the long-term stewardship of the title and properties in light of the Duke's extended seclusion and recent developments. It was his move. He was attempting to have Alistair declared incompetent, to seize control of the duchy. Annalise found Alistair in the library, the letter in his hand. He looked defeated. The old fear was back, a shroud over his features. "He will use my solitude against me," Alistair said, his voice hollow. "He will paint me as my father's son. They will see the madness in me, whether it is there or not." "No," Annalise said, her voice firm. She went to the small escritoire in her sitting room and retrieved a folded, worn document from a locked box. It was her copy of their marriage contract, the one thing she had made sure to take with her all those years ago. It was legal, binding, and irrefutable proof of her position. They will see the Duchess of Blackwood, and they will see the future Duke. She walked into the formal drawing room an hour later, uninvited. The four men were already seated. Peregrine Croft looked up in surprise, a flicker of irritation crossing his smooth features. Lord Sedgwick, an old friend of the family and one of the trustees, looked merely curious. Alistair sat stiffly in his chair, a man waiting for the axe to fall. "Gentlemen," Annalise said, her voice calm and clear, echoing slightly in the high-ceilinged room. "I believe this meeting concerns my family. It is only right that I be present." Croft recovered quickly, his charming smile snapping back into place. "Your Grace, of course. We are merely discussing some dry legal matters, trying to ease the burden on His Grace." "I am quite certain my husband is capable of bearing his own burdens," Annalise replied, her gaze level. "But it seems you are concerned about the future of the Blackwood line. Allow me to set your minds at ease." She walked to the center of the room, placing the marriage contract on the polished table. "This is my marriage contract. It confirms my status, which has never been legally contested." Then she turned toward the door and nodded to Mrs. Gable, who was waiting outside. The housekeeper entered, leading Thomas by the hand. The boy stood, small and a little overwhelmed, in the doorway. He was dressed in a simple but well-made suit, his dark hair neatly combed. He looked directly at Alistair. "And this," Annalise said, her voice ringing with an authority she did not know she possessed, "is Thomas Beaumont. He is the son and heir of the Duke of Blackwood. His legitimacy is not a matter for debate." Croft scoffed lightly. "A boy appears after 10 years, Duchess. You must understand our need for certainty." This was the moment. Alistair was silent, trapped in his own fear. It was her choice, her action. She turned her full attention to Croft, her eyes as cold as a winter sea. "Certainty, Mr. Croft? Look at him. Look at the Duke. If you require more certainty than what your own eyes can see, then you are not merely ambitious, you are a fool." She did not stop there. She did not let them frame the narrative. She seized it. "You speak of my husband's seclusion," she went on, her voice resonating with passion and truth. "You wish to paint it as instability, as the shadow of his father. You are wrong. For 10 years, the Duke has lived a life of profound and solitary discipline. He has not indulged in whims or vices. He has managed this estate with meticulous care. His seclusion was not a sign of madness, but an act of immense, if misplaced, responsibility. It was an act of grief and a deep-seated fear of causing harm. A fear a man like you, Mr. Croft, could never comprehend." She looked at Alistair, who was staring at her, his expression one of utter astonishment. He was seeing her for the first time, not as the girl he sent away, but as the woman she had become. Hope, once a distant star, felt as warm and near as a candle held in her own hands. "The period of seclusion is over," she declared, turning back to the trustees. "The Duke has his family by his side now. The future of this house is secure." She walked over to Thomas and placed a hand on his shoulder. Then she looked directly at Alistair, a silent question in her eyes. "Stand with me." Slowly, as if waking from a long dream, Alistair rose to his feet. He crossed the room and stood beside her and his son. He did not look at Croft or the trustees. He looked at Annalise, his eyes filled with a gratitude and dawning admiration so profound it took her breath away. He placed his hand over hers on Thomas's shoulder, a united front, a family. Peregrine Croft saw it all. He saw the irrefutable proof in the boy's face, the legal power in the contract, and the unshakable partnership that had just been forged before his eyes. He saw his ambitions turn to dust. His face, for the first time, was stripped of its charm, revealing the ugly greed beneath. He stood, gave a curt, venomous bow, and walked out of the room without another word. The threat was gone. In the silence that followed, Lord Sedgwick cleared his throat. He smiled, a genuine, warm smile. "Well," he said, looking between Alistair and Annalise, "it seems the stewardship of Blackwood is in better hands than ever. Welcome home, Your Grace." That night, after Thomas was asleep, Annalise stood on the balcony of her room, looking out at the moonlit gardens. She heard the door open behind her. It was Alistair. He came to stand beside her, a respectful distance between them. "You saved me today," he said quietly. "You saved us all." "You saved yourself, Alistair," she replied, turning to face him. "You just needed someone to remind you that you weren't your father's ghost." "You did more than that," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You showed me who you are. I spent 10 years believing I had done the right thing, protecting you from a life with me. I see now that I wasn't protecting you. I was robbing myself of you. I was robbing our son of his father. Can you ever forgive me for that wasted decade?" She looked at him, at the genuine remorse and the fragile hope in his eyes. "There is nothing to forgive," she said softly. "We cannot change the past. But we can choose the future." Together, he took a hesitant step closer, his hand coming up to gently cup her cheek. His touch was warm, tentative, as if he were touching something precious he feared he might break. "Annalise," he whispered her name, and this time it was not a ghost of a sound, but a prayer. He leaned in and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, but of homecoming. It was a kiss of gratitude, of promise, of a new beginning built on the ashes of an old sorrow. It was the closing of a chapter 10 years long, and the opening of another. 2 years later, the great hall of Blackwood Manor was filled with sunlight. The heavy velvet curtains had been drawn back, and the suits of armor now seemed to guard a home rather than a tomb. The sound of a boy's laughter echoed from the gardens, where Thomas, now a confident 12-year-old, was learning archery from his father. Annalise stood by the window, watching them. Alistair was a different man. The profound stillness had been replaced by a quiet contentment. He smiled easily now, especially when he looked at his son or at her. The shadows had not vanished entirely. Some griefs are etched too deep, but they no longer ruled him. He was present, he was engaged, he was free. Their life was not one of grand romance, but of quiet partnership and deepening affection. They talked for hours in the library, sharing the stories of their lost decade, slowly, carefully weaving 2 separate lives into one. He had come to cherish her strength and wisdom, and she, in turn, had found the kind, honorable man who had been hiding behind a wall of fear. She felt a hand on her waist and turned to see Alistair had come inside. He followed her gaze out to the garden, where Thomas had just managed to hit the outer ring of the target and was cheering in triumph. "He has your determination," Alistair said, his voice warm with pride. "And your aim, apparently," she countered with a small smile. He turned her to face him, his expression serious. "I have never properly thanked you, Annalise. Not just for that day, but for every day. You walked back into my life and showed me what it could be. You brought the light back to this house. We did that together, she insisted. Worth was not something granted by a title or a husband, it was something you claimed for yourself. She had learned that in her small cottage by the sea, and she had proven it in this grand, imposing manner. He pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her in a gesture that was now familiar and comforting. She rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. Outside, on the great iron gates, the Blackwood Raven still clutched its key. For a decade, she had seen it as a symbol of secrets kept, of a door locked against her. But now, she understood. The key did not lock something away. It opened it. It had been waiting all along for the right hand to turn it.